I'm going to invite up our next speaker, Cari Goetcheusl, but before I do, I also want to mention and acknowledge the help of the rapporteur for this session. And maybe you could just raise your hand. It's Karen Woodhouse-Beyer. And Karen, in addition to being with us at the conference, is actually Assistant Director of the Program of Cultural Heritage and Preservation Studies here at Rutgers, the program that we're in. And she's a lecturer in both anthropology and the art history departments here at Rutgers, so she keeps very busy. Thanks so much, Karen. Great. So our next and final speaker before we go into the dialogue portion of this session is Cari Goetcheusl. And Cari is the associate professor at the University of Georgia in its College of Environment and Design and Cultural Landscape Laboratory. From 2005 to 2011, she served as assistant professor in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture at Clemson University, and prior to her academic career, she worked with the National Park Service as a historical landscape architect on a cultural landscape inventory, so it connects nicely to some of the earlier talks we heard. And among her recent publications is one called Contextual Design Rooted in the Cultural Traditions of African American Communities Along the Carolina Coast. And her talk today is going to focus on the Gullah Geechee communities along the Carolina coast. So thank you, Kara.
Similar to my colleagues, I am very honored to be here today, and thank you very much for the time. I'm going to talk a bit about the Gullah Geechee communities on the East Coast. So to help orient you, the historic extent of the Gullah Geechee communities are from the southern part of the state of North Carolina to the northern part of the state of Florida. Although I would say when you think about a concentration of peoples today, traditionally you would think mostly South Carolina and the Georgia coastal areas. The thing that's interesting about the Gullah Geechee, there's many, many things that are interesting about the Gullah Geechee people who I have an immense esteem and respect for the more I learn of their ways. First, I wanted to kind of clarify terms, Gullah and Geechee. They actually are locational in a variety of definitions of locational. Gullah, even though there's no specific origination of the term, there's two general theories as to where the term came from. With these Africans being taken from West Africa in 16, 17, 1800s, usually the thought is Angola, Gullah, would be potentially one portion of the term Gullah. Also, there is a Gullah ethnic group in Africa that possibly could be the essence of that, as well as when the Spanish were in South Carolina and Georgia, their term for a Native American group was Guale, so it's very possible the combination of all that could be the term Gullah. Similar with Geechee, there is an African ethnic group called the Geechee that could be from have been brought to this area. And also the Ogeechee River in the Savannah area is a very strong geographical feature, and so it's possible the Gullah and Geechee terms could come from those entities. And so generally when you think Gullah, it's intended to be more of the South Carolina into North Carolina area, and Geechee to be more in the Georgia and Florida area. So I'm going to talk a bit about a study that I had the honor to be a part of, trying to figure out if there's a possibility of National Register designation and even going towards World Heritage classification. So at nearly the same time that all of the study was going on, there was a lot of emphasis on creating a cultural heritage corridor, the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. And as you can see, the outline, it's, I would say, partially arbitrary because it is a 30-mile distance from the coast inland. It does not actually follow physiographic edge at that 30-mile distance. It is more a construct. But it is an area that historically, that was where a lot of the agricultural lands were. That is where a lot of the population density was located in those areas. Ecologically, when you think about the coastal areas of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida, very, for the most part, low-lying estuaries, wetlands, thank you, rivers, and the topographic difference over that 30 miles is usually about 30 feet. So it's a very, very low-lying landscape, and can be very hostile in certain seasons. So the first thing I want to do is kind of, I guess, educate you on some of the pieces that I understand about the Gullah Geechee settlements. And a little bit of this work is based on Elizabeth Brabeck's work in Beaufort, South Carolina. But when you see this, you will say many different cultures settle in this pattern. This is nothing different. And I would agree with you. It just happens to be in this one particular area that now has a unique kind of language and foodways and various aspects. But when you look at the map on the right-hand side here, you can see it's a very organic form when it comes to the roadways, the properties, and you might even have clusters of housing on what would be considered one lot. And that is a very traditional kind of settlement pattern where a person may or may not own a piece of property, and then as you have children and they have children, you keep splitting up, and it breaks down, and you have your family compound. It's very common to have all of your relatives living and building very, very close to where you are, and then you have community spaces between the buildings, community kind of picnic areas and work areas. So the images on the left are images from 1938 in the Charleston area that kind of indicate the types of housing and the types of agricultural structures and fencing and things. But one of the things I really want to point out with the Gullah Geechee people specifically is something called heirs property. And because a lot of this ownership is somewhat undeclared legally, it has become a very, very big problem, land ownership. And because the family basically has shares and it hasn't been traced and it isn't legally documented, there's actually in the state of South Carolina previously, they've actually enhanced this law lately, but it was very easy for a 4th, 5th, 10th generation family member who no longer even lives in the area to be approached by a developer out in California or in Ohio, sell their share, which would then actually force the sale of every single other person's share, and the land would be lost. And it has been said that approximately 50% of the Gullah lands that had been owned previously have been lost from that kind of development pressure. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about also was just Gullah Geechee places. When we look, I'll go backwards. When we look at this entire area, probably one of the common factors that I think is interesting is initially it was really considered a very hostile environment, and because of that, there was the Gullah and Geechee were very isolated. They may have been working on agricultural areas on plantations, but really when you talk about quantity, demographics, quantity of Gullah Geechee versus, say, white overseers or something, it was very small populations of white to very large populations of Gullah Geechee. And so a lot of that African tradition and culture and food and language ended up really creating its same essence and carrying on through time. And not really until very late in the game was there huge influences. But the other thing is when you look at the Gullah Geechee places in South Carolina and Georgia specifically, you see a lot of those places are now incredibly desirable tourist destinations and resort destinations. So just that hypocrisy of where things are and what people like to do and see at different times. So one of the main reasons that this study even came about was because of the exponential growth in the Charleston area of population in the 1990s and 2000s. And what I'm going to do is just show you a little bit of time lapse, shall we say. But essentially, it really did transform the social and demographic and cultural heritage of the area. In Mount Pleasant, which I'll just, as a side note, say, now it actually has the term sometimes Mount Plastic, by people who don't see what it was originally there, but only see the fast food strips and all the shopping and things. This area, which was not a desirable area to be in for a very long time, was definitely 97% Gullah Geechee, 3% white. It has, since the early 90s, changed 180 degrees, that it is now 90%, 97% white population, and actually incoming, not even from the area, and only 3% Gullah in general. But you'll see by the 1949 image where there's really quite a bit of agricultural land. There is a community called Remley's Point here, and a community, the town of the village of Mount Pleasant, technically. This is the road that goes to the bridge that then goes over into Charleston, which is somewhere in here. And the historic road would come down, go into the village of Mount Pleasant, and then come up and then keep going off up the coast. So by 1973, a bypass had been built, so you didn't have to go down to the village. You could go much quicker up the coast. And you can start to see there's certainly a more infill in the Remley's Point area. There's more development that's occurring, even though there is some agriculture and such. But by the time you get to 2006, really the landscape has changed dramatically. You can still see pieces, and Remley's Point does still exist, and the village does still exist, but it's very difficult to see a few other places. So one of the reasons that we were looking at this area is not just the Gullah Geechee broadly, but I don't know who may or may not know about something called sweetgrass baskets, but they're very, I guess, iconographic craft that is being done by the Gullah Geechee in this area. And I understand that there are certain kinds of baskets that are still made in Africa that if you put them side by side, you literally would know exactly what the origin of them are. So and you can see from this image in the 1930s that there were these basket stands and people who were doing this traditional basket making for generations. And the story is that many of these original baskets were being used on the plantations as large rice fanners and sifters, ways to help with certain agricultural production as well as daily use. So the idea was that not only is this area really considered the epicenter of where sweetgrass baskets were created from, but that, of course, it was a very strong Gullah Geechee heritage. But the thing that I found was, although many, many people since the 30s and the 20s have been, in quotes, studying the language, the food ways, the spirituality, many, many different aspects, when it came to actually place or landscape or community, they really weren't looking a lot at those kinds of aspects, especially physical aspects. And so it was interesting that the 10 or 15 communities that we chose to look at are literally within the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So because cultural landscapes are inherently multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever term, phrase you want to use these days, it was absolutely critical to us that we actually use a mixed methodology to approach and try to understand what this place was. So, of course, ethnography had to be one of the key things. And many, many oral histories were done, as well as interviews and tours around the area. We really wanted to understand what the planning communities were doing and not doing. Also with geography, of course, we were doing vegetation mapping, land-based confirmation of information, looking at historic aerial photos, current photos, using GIS to help do some analysis. And then, of course, doing kind of traditional state historic preservation surveys, but we are also very interested in landscape elements, specifically yard use, as well as trying to find areas where materials might still be collected. That sweetgrass basket traditionally would go out into the landscape and collect materials, and now as development was increasing, you were finding you had to go further and further to actually find those materials and had to kind of use a middleman, actually, who would bring it from quite far away. And so the materials weren't exactly local, but they were still coastal. So as I mentioned with ethnography, because we found that, surprise, surprise, a lot of the Gullah Geechee heritage is not actually in repositories, is not actually documented in any way, we couldn't find a lot of this information. We could certainly look at images and try to understand just through aerial photographs how things were, but we really ended up doing about 35 or 40 different oral history interviews, asking a number of different questions from, and this was not only these people's occupations, and we did choose to speak to mostly elders in the community, as those elders were identified to us and if they were willing to speak with us, but it was to ask about their parents and what they could recall from their grandparents when it came to community. And as you can imagine, as a social structure, the church becomes incredibly important, specifically the AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church, becomes incredibly important for communication and connection across time. But we also asked many things about churches and businesses and things like that. So to me, this is probably the most useful map that we produced for a lot of different reasons. But to give you an idea, one of the main questions that we asked the individual elders is two things. What would you consider your historic boundary of your community? And for example, this is one community called Snowden. And then what would you consider your current boundary of your community? And so any of these images where you see a lighter color and a darker color, that's essentially what's happening there. But to help orient you with what some of these communities are, once again, the bridge that comes down, many of these communities are relating to their distance from the foot of the bridge. So for example, this is 2 mile, 4 mile, 6 mile, 7 mile, 10 mile, and there's actually 15 mile that we worked with. Then we also worked with Snowden, Phillips, Remley's Point, and the Village. So, and Green Hill. So very different communities, and they really cross the range of historic hamlets that evolved out of plantation culture to literally planned communities that addressed black flight out of Charleston at an earlier time. Some of the things we looked at were zoning and planning, and one of the things the main thing to get out of these images is these red dots are the areas that we're looking at, but really that there's color in some areas and color not in other areas has to do with who has what jurisdiction, and then hence what land use controls. And so you can see in any one of these communities, there are areas that are colored in, that means that is the village of Mount Pleasant, and the areas that are not colored in, which means it's the county, and they have different jurisdictions and different kinds of stipulations on density, et cetera. So just to give you an idea of some of the areas, Phillips community, which historically was along the river, and the road was built through the middle of it. And Snowden, which is this area here, which has essentially remained agricultural nearly the whole time. I'm just going to give you a little visual journey of Snowden from 2006 backwards in time. So once again, you'll notice quite a bit of development on the edges of it. And then as we go back in time, how the agriculture worked. So as we were doing our surveys, we found it very important, of course, to have these community liaisons. And so our oral history and reviews had really helped quite a bit in getting that established. We ended up moving through and doing a very traditional National Register nomination form for properties, and then a custom form. In the end, we did about 3,000 properties over 8 months, and looking at historic resources from a traditional sense definition. And we did find many, I'll call them traditional historic houses, but the things that I find actually more interesting are these very simple concrete structures, because when it was essentially codified that African Americans were not allowed to have mortgages in the 50s and 60s, the perseverance to actually have kind of an Amish barn raising, where people had electrical skills, masonry skills, plumbing skills, et cetera, and slowly they would buy the materials, they would get so far. They would work more, save the money, buy more materials, get their friends to help them with things. So there's very rich story in this area. And you can see examples of roadways that are, what did I just do? Oh, okay. Roadways that are literally in the same exact location for 300 years. Sweetgrass basket stands along the sides of the roads, gardens that have literally been in the same place for about 100, 120 years. Some river areas, cemeteries that are in the middle of woods. A lot of the kind of structures that were being torn down to build these kinds of development, grasses that were, we found a whole medicinal knowledge and gathering knowledge for mosquito repellent, things like this. We started to identify some of the key places and document them in kind of a HALS kind of way, with structures in the landscape. We started to itemize what plants were being gathered and understood by the community members, what were being grown specifically for other reasons for themselves or for sale, and trying to compare historic and current images to figure out where either equalization schools are being built in the 50s and 60s, or where traditional store and corner stores are, We were also looking at historic imagery to then do GIS mapping where potentially districts might be encouraged. And from all of that, started to plot out where these potential communities might have enough there to potentially nominate. One of the things I wanted to kind of end with is this one student project where we started to look at the red dots that are here are locations of known Gullah communities back in the early 1900s. And when you look at the this is the progression of population. So in the 1750s, the population, the darkest gray there, then like the next layer, and the orange is the urban growth boundary. We were looking both at the cultural resources and at the natural resources to show kind of what the proposed threat might be with 20, 30 proposals of where development is going to be. And we found that essentially the impact, the furthest out gray area in each is where the 2030 proposed development will occur. Charleston is an incredibly fragile environment, and it seems like the powers that be don't really understand that very well. And it's a very desirable place to be. There's been a lot of influx of population. But what we found is not only are the natural resources going to be dramatically hampered by that, but that by the time the development occurs, close to 95% of the Gullah communities will be engulfed by development. So, okay, I don't want to have that end as like, oh. So I have some opportunities at the end, okay? So yes, the challenges are that really these resources have not been valued, and because they haven't been valued, there aren't those protections in place that actually have teeth. There are some overlay districts, but they aren't really strong enough to help. The biggest impact that I see to the Gullah Geechee traditional lands is something that from the language of the Gullah, the Binyas, the Kumyas, and the Kumbakyas. Basically the people who've been here, who are coming here, and the people who are returning back in that reverse migration, and the quantity of people. Heiress property, as I had mentioned, it's a still a very big threat. And probably some of the bigger issues to address are because these have been disparate communities for so long, and it's been reinforced to not have communication on a variety of levels, they really have been focusing only on themselves, and they haven't really been focusing about what kind of power they would have if they actually thought in a much larger scale. And they're just not used to working together, as well as they've been focusing really primarily on health and welfare type issues, not on heritage conservation in this particular sense. However, always the optimist that I am, the idea is that there has been, at one point in time, it really was not looked well at all if you were called Gullah, and you would actually try to hide that from people. The resurgence in pride in being Gullah is absolutely unstoppable. Most of the people in the area are very, very clear that this is where they've come from. It's where they want to be. So there has been a renewed interest in many of the folkways, whether it is the language or the food or the basket making and the land. So there has been tons of idea about culture, dealing with tourism, but then how do you balance that in protecting the places that actually exist? St. Helena Island is probably one of the most powerful places in the Gullah culture. It is outside of Charleston, further south, but many would actually say that this is the core of the Gullah Geechee nation, and they do consider themselves a nation. They do have a queen. That there's also a concerted effort for decades to privatize on St. Helena, so a lot of the heiress property issues that have kind of gone awry in other areas has actually been somewhat stabilized in, on the St. Helen community. And the Penn Center has long been a huge advocate and kind of the heart of the Gullah Geechee nation as a jumping off point for activism. The thing that's been interesting is the community advocacy groups. Working with local governments, actually thinking outside the box and how can we work together to conserve lands, working with developers to actually plant sweetgrass, harvest sweetgrass, so they're being very proactive, recognizing that the developers are using them, calling their communities sweetgrass plantation, that kind of thing, but they're actually kind of, I'll call it a mutual use of one another. They're understanding things, they're getting a stronger political voice. The land planning agencies are beginning to understand this and changing their dwelling units per acre to reflect what those traditional values are. And then there is a Center for Heiress Property that's beginning to look at all of this. So. believe that's it. Thank you.
Cari, thank you so much. It's a great, very multi-dimensional project and wonderful to see. So.